Author's note, page 289. When I was growing up, Typhoid Mary was an urban legend who had purposefully killed hundreds of people. She was an evil murderess who spread disease to those that she hated. She was a comic book villain. Her nickname had become part of our lingo, a term for someone who carries a dangerous disease and spreads it because they refuse to take proper precautions. She was a symbol, not a person. Clearly, I didn't know the real story. When I met Mary Mallon in my research, her actual life surprised me. A poor Irish immigrant who tried to fit in with the wealthy New York families. She wanted a better life for herself and couldn't understand why she was being persecuted. I saw how the deaths she caused were based on ignorance, not willful intent to kill. She was a woman of her time, when bleeding or opening up the arteries to let out the blood was still a regular practice among doctors, and the idea of bacteria, good or bad, had not yet become common knowledge. I felt that I needed to tell Mary's true story, to restore her honor in a way. To me, Mary's life was a special kind of immigrant tale, and I wanted to find a sympathetic protagonist who might understand her. It was my grandmother who allowed me to comprehend the immigrants and their children's journey from foreigner to American. I have a photo of Grandma as a girl slouching in front of the ride on Coney Island with a rebel look in her eye, wearing dark lipstick and a loose dress, probably taken around 1920. I knew that she fought against her own Eastern European father's orthodox religious practice. A picture of him with a long-bearded rabbi hung in her living room, but she never spoke about him. As a second-generation American Jew, Grandma's behavior conflicted with the stereotypes that I often read about immigrant families who passed down their old country ways and stayed the same. Grandma couldn't have been more different from the stereotype. For instance, she held Passover every year, but she led no Shabbat candles, no prayers, and rarely stepped foot inside a temple. By the time I met her, she was a tough old New Yorker, an American through and through. If you must remember this, an oral history you must remember this, an oral history of Manhattan from the 1890s to World War II, and other books, I read the stories of the immigrants who fiercely wanted to be American first and foremost, and did everything they could to do so. They told how they quickly modified their foreign habits by learning English, dressing in factory-made clothes, and going to the popular entertainments of the time. Many of them kept ties with their roots and religions, but loosened the hold of their past had on them. Mostly, they stayed with the same cook. Mostly, what stayed the same was their cooking, which explains why my grandmother's sumptuous Passover spread. I was influenced by my paternal grandmother as well, an independent woman who raised my father alone while working full-time as a nurse. She was, in fact, the first nurse to use the X-ray machine. I will always remember the white hat and dress and the shoes that defined her. Making fiction from reality is a tricky business. When piecing together the past from documents that may or may not be accurate, a writer has to arrive at her own interpretation of history. Jacob Riis's newspaper reports, books, and photographs helped me to see how people really lived in the tenements. Despite their exaggerations, in the yellow journalism of the day gave me the sense of the public's reaction to Mary. Mr. Soper's own articles and medical journals showed me his path to Mary. Judith Walter Levitt's book, Typhoid Mary, explained why Mary herself didn't accept the label as a healthy carrier as typhoid fever. I had to fill many gaps and accept the fact that the real players were going to have to engage with the fictional characters. Mr. Soper, Dr. Baker, Mr. Briggs, or Biggs, Mr. Thompson, and of course Mary Mallon all existed, though their roles were altered to fit the story. The way Mr. Soper discovered Mary through his investigations of the household interviews and their families, and ultimately the peach ice cream, is true. Mary's physical threats of Mr. Soper were real, though I think her verbal assaults were probably much worse. The timeline of events was the most difficult for me to recreate. I had to shorten the action of things. What took days or weeks in my book often took months or years. It took Mr. Soper longer to find Mary, and she didn't petition the courts until 1909, years after she was captured. In the end, with Mary's return to quarantine, leaving the reader to wonder what became of her, 1 year after the hearing in 1910, a newly elected judge who wanted to maintain voter approval discharged Mary from North Brother Island. She returned to Manhattan, promising that she would find other work and never cook for the public again. Just 5 years later, in 1915, a typhoid epidemic broke out at Sloan Maternity Hospital. A cook named Mrs. Brown was discovered working in the kitchen. The cook had passed the typhoid bacteria to 27 victims, 2 of whom died. Upon further investigation, it was found that Mrs. Brown was actually Mary Mallon. She simply never understood how, being healthy as a horse, she could be responsible for passing the typhoid fever, or maybe, without help from the Department of Health, she was unable to find other work. After Mary Mallon's second capture, she was returned to North Brother Island, where she spent the rest of her life, nearly 25 years, in a small cabin with her dog. The doctors never removed her gallbladder. In her lifetime, they found no remedy for the healthy carrier of typhoid fever.